Hello, Poetry Project. Woo woo. Thank you. Thanks so much for being here, everyone. My name's Ethan Philbrick. It's my real pleasure to welcome you here tonight. I'm the curator in residence here at the Poetry Project. I don't know if you've noticed, but it's a very full room. And so we're in this together. We're going to figure out tonight. And so if for anybody who's doesn't have a seat, is on the floor or standing, and you ever get to a juncture in your evening where it's just not tenable anymore and you need to figure it out, feel free to move. We don't have to be really docile audience members and just stay in the put. If you need to move around, move around. There is a bunch of space on the floor over here. It's not good sight lines, but for people who are standing, if you ever get really tired of standing, this whole area, you can sit here, feel free. But thank you so much for being here. It's exciting that so many of us want to be here. So, okay, I am going to just start us with a brief introduction. Welcome to the third consecutive year of Psychoanalysis and Poetry. In general, this series has aimed to investigate the psychoanalytic dimensions of poetry and the poetics of psychoanalysis by pairing a psychoanalytic clinician who works in or around poetry with a poet or a writer who works in or around psychoanalysis. I was drawn to initiate this series because psychoanalysis and poetry share a significant conceptual and practical terrain. Both are committed to saying the unsayable and thinking the unthought. Both pay excited attention to the libidinal force of language and linguistic breakdown. Both have a persistent investment in sustained listening and spaces of co-presence. Both generate contentious frictions between theory and practice, and both carry political ambivalence within them. Both poetry and psychoanalysis share a history and class position as strenuous leisure activities for the wealthy, distinct and yet related echo chambers of self-extension for the moody and suffering rich, and yet also both offer the possibility of free association and radical critique as conceptual and practical resources for revolutionary struggle and insurgent activity. So this year, our event opens both psychoanalysis and poetry to their outsides by turning to performance. Engvo, a choreographer, writer, and artist who creates performances that torque and twist psychoanalytic concepts, will share new writing accompanied by the violist and composer Jessica Pavone. And then immediately following that, there will be a little break while we just move the stage around a bit, but not like a full intermission, so stay with us. And then following Avgi Saketopoulou, a leading theorist of psychoanalytic political concepts whose work forcefully pushes psychoanalysis beyond its limits as a clinical extension of liberal ideology, will also share new writing with us tonight. And then following that, both Vo and Saketopoulou will join each other for a brief conversation. So again, if you ever need to move, please do. Just get up, do what you need. We'll all be forgiving of each other and help each other move around. For anybody who works here at the Poetry Project or is a volunteer at the Poetry Project, will you just raise your hand? Just look around, get a sense of who these people are. If you ever need anything in the space, well, one, to thank them on your way out for being such a wonderful staff. And then also, if you need something in the space, if you're someone standing and you actually really need to figure out a different situation, come find us and we'll try to help. We'll do what we can. There are bathrooms, gender-neutral bathrooms, one floor up here. There is on this floor, more mobility-accessible bathroom through another space. So also find one of us who just raised our hands if you want to use that bathroom. And again, don't be shy. We'll figure it out. Come do that at any point in the night. And please come back. We are just in the midst of a really exciting season. On Monday night, we have a gorgeous music show that will be happening here. 2 bands, Neti Neti and Sonono, will be here playing. Check your programs, come back around. And thank you so much for being here. Okay, so let's give a round of applause to welcome Engvo and Jessica Pavone.
I feel bad having my butt against you all. I'm sorry. Okay, I wrote this, I guess what's the context? Spent the past few years just sort of learning and self-teaching a lot, mostly self-teaching how to do possession rituals. So I guess that's all you need to know. The first time I truly understood the horror of what it meant to be possessed, I was lying on the couch, asleep in my best friend's apartment in Washington, D.C., outside of any sanctioned ritual space, away from the myriad forms of possession rituals that I grew up with in Vietnam. It arrived in a dream without warning, beyond my consensual limit. And a little bit of context here in terms of friendship. We both came from Southeast Asia, and we went to the UK to this cult of a high school together, and they sort of teach us that we could be world leaders and we're gonna solve world peace. And and then we came to the US and we tried really hard to stay here, and so a lot of our friendship already operate on this level of beyond and beneath language. That night, I dreamed that I was being raped by a group of men in a restaurant in my childhood home. The experience was so overwhelming that even in the dream, I blacked out. When I regained awareness, it was over. I walked home, but the world has already been drained of its meaning. It flattened into a gray, affectless field. Leaves were falling. I registered the movement, but it did not move me. The fact of their falling failed to register as anything at all. The world went on empty of whatever made it feel alive. I woke up from the long, unending dream and told my friend everything in great detail. I admitted that much of the memory was familiar, but the grayscale, along with its dullness and deadness, terrified me. It felt distinctively foreign. I could not quite grasp where that could have come from, and my friend just gave a curt response. That's just how I feel all the time. The nonchalance of this statement did not register as recognition as much as displacement. It soon became clear that I was feeling his feelings, but even this formulation presumes a stability that had already begun to break down. The I and the his no longer held as separate entities. His pain leaked out of his tightly bounded container of the individual to seep into my own, hitchhiking on the vessel of my memories to make itself perceptible. Perhaps his contagious latent affect also created a psychic opening within myself through which I could touch the depth of my own unrecognizable suffering. The foreignness could just as easily be his as mine. However, within the metaphysics of possessions, there's no meaningful distinction between the otherness within oneself and the otherness within other. Here, neither the I nor the other can sustain the equilibrium of its dialectical opposition. What I have narrated as an intimate experience of possession, philosopher and psychoanalytic theorist Teresa Brennan would describe as a transmission of affect, For her, affect always negative, thoughtless, such as grief, anxiety, depression, is unwanted by the individuated subject. Therefore, affects get projected outwards to maintain the fantasy of coherence and self-containment. If not discerned, thought through, and transformed into articulated feelings, affect does not stay where it originates, but lingers in the air and gets taken up by others. Hence, we always feel in anxiety-laden rooms. Extending the Kleinian theory of projective identification into a more explicitly quasi-magical register of intersubjectivity, Brandon described a condition of radical psychic entanglement. We feel others' unwanted affect all the time, infusing this affective otherness with symbolic materials of our own. As an example, she writes, "If I pick up your depression, my focus may be on my unfinished book. Yours, more seriously, may be the loss of a loved person." Underlying this formulation is something like a formula of possession. Others become the unwitting receptacles through which affect is made to be experienced. Your depression, my unfinished book, your melancholy, my sexual assault. In my case, however, the language of transmission as something atmospheric and diffuse does not quite capture the blunt force of what occurred through my dream. What took place felt less like a transmission than a non-consensual seizure. A violent hijacking of my psychic field. Possession, then, would be the more precise term. Although this kind of powerful and unexpected penetration of the other at the limit of one's consent, as Avgi would like to say, it does happen from time to time. It is rare for possession to occur outside a ritualistic container. For instance, Hodong, a northern Vietnamese possession ritual, takes place in a temple and lasts for at least a full day and often more. There's a shaman who manages the presence of quote-unquote low-level spirits and facilitates the arrival of gods and deities, guiding the sequence of events, maintaining the elaborate structure within which possession can take place. The ritual is highly regulated. The frame is more or less fixed. Certain preparation activities have to be completed in advance of the main event. There's a clear architectural demarcation between the area where witnesses sit and the raised platform inhabited by the shaman and their assistants. There are clear hierarchies of gods and deities corresponding to a precise sequence of invocation. Once the shaman becomes possessed, there are also strict expectations around conduct. How one bows in the presence of spirits, how one speaks to spirits when getting directly addressed, how one is never to touch the spirits that are coursing through the shaman's bodily vessel. Money plays a crucial role. In order for blessing and healing to truly take place, the person organizing the ritual must spend and spend excessively. The expenditure must feel disproportionately large in relation to one's means. It must hurt. Pain here marks a threshold a point at which capital logic of equivalence begins to dissolve. You are not getting what you pay for. You are not setting the terms of transaction. In seeking guidance from God, you simply have to give without the guarantee of receiving anything in return. Thus, you surrender to the unknown and the unknowable. This gradual remembering of money as a shamanistic currency relieves a lot of my angst for having to pay so much for my psychoanalytic treatment. What used to feel like a puncture of capitalism into the intimacy of psychoanalysis begins to take on a religious valence. The fee no longer reads simply as a payment for a service rendered, but as a quotidian form of sacrifice, a sacred pact which binds me to the analytic process and marks my commitment to remain within it without certainty of outcome. Under this translation, the analytic frame and the ritualistic container collapse into one another. In fact, I would say that the analytic frame would not be possible without the quote-unquote primitive precedence of rituals. The fixed duration, the high-frequency repetition of sessions, the meticulous consistency of the office, the baseline expectations around conduct, all of it becomes shrouded in a mysterious veil. And it is this sense of mystery that pulls me deeper into psychoanalysis, not because it has become more convincing, but because I begin to recognize in it something I already am familiar with. Ritual emerges as a disavowed genealogy of psychoanalysis, a lineage that has been systematically stripped of its language, but not its structure or principle. What is psychoanalysis if not a durational possession ritual that refuses to name itself as such? What is transference if not spirit possession, where both the analyst and the patient are taken over and lose themselves to the forces of history? What is the analytic frame, if not a ritualistic container that allow for the possibility of transformation? What is interpretation, if not divination, practiced under the sign of science? What is the analyst, if not a shaman, a disciple of enlightenment? What is analytic neutrality, if not a ritual mask? What is the couch, if not a divination tool? What is the fee, if not a very expensive offering? What is free association, if not speaking in tongues? What is repression, if not exorcism interjected by the individuated subject? What is trauma, if not haunting, stripped of its folk origins? What is the unconscious, if not spirits, demons, and deities transposed into the meta-psychology of the individual? What else might psychoanalysis become if it were less invested in securing the social legitimacy of science and more willing to acknowledge the folk magic ritualistic principles that sustain it? The night before I went into the hospital for a total thyroidectomy, I took a long hot shower I squatted inside the bathtub, eyes closed, streams of water running down my face, tears perhaps. I had only ever gone under anesthesia once, but had never been surgically cut open before. I had a gig coming up in 4 weeks. I wonder if my body would be strong enough to dance. I wonder if the surgical slit at the front of my throat would be visible. Could I make the wound more apparent somehow to scare the audience a little bit? Might this aggressive exhibition of pain force a confrontation with our shared mortality? Amidst the churn in my head, I felt a spirit guiding my hands as I was washing my hair. The motion suddenly became weightless. It was a hand, maternal yet formless at the same time. I wanted to know who it was, but there was no need. I did not need an assurance of form. As I surrendered to this divine visitation, a quiet, unspeakable sense of peace settled over me. I knew I was going to be okay. And in that moment of utter helplessness, I could see why a lot of people, someone out there, somebody, not me, but someone, would reach out their hands to God, begging for mercy. It's hard to not know that tomorrow I will not wake up to the certainty of my non-existence. It's hard to not know that tomorrow I will not wake up to the certainty of my non-existence. It's hard to not know that tomorrow I will not wake up to the certainty of my non-existence. It's hard to not know that tomorrow I will not wake up to the certainty of my non-existence. It's hard to not know that tomorrow I will not wake up to the certainty of my non-existence. Religion is the opiate of the masses. As my mother likes to repeat, echoing the bastardized Marxist-Leninist slogan that circulate in the Vietnamese education system. Her teaching has nothing to do with class consciousness or the proletariat revolution. Rather, it is her idiosyncratic way of warning me about the danger of superstition, of losing oneself to the powerful drug of magic and ritual. I must not become my father, who obsessively turns to the spirit world in order to escape his pain. The shattering experience of fighting in the war with America does not let up on him. What cannot be processed begins to take hold in other forms. Spirits do not guide so much as they govern his life. Less a source of orientation than a distraction from his own brokenness. A psychosis that feels like a perverse mutation of folk magic. Hunted by my father as a mimetic devil, I find myself unable to pray to God in earnest. I struggle with the act of worship, less because I do not believe in God than because surrender feels too risky. How am I to know that the God I give myself to will not lead me astray the way it did with my father? What guarantee is there that I am losing myself to something worthwhile? The peculiar form of possession rituals I have performed over the years is strictly secular, despite being grounded in the northern Vietnamese folk religion of Mother Goddess Đạo Mẫu. The transcendent being of Mother Goddess, along with her ranks of Thánh Cô, Thánh Cậu, is not something that I devotedly subscribe to, but the need to surrender to a cosmic something beyond myself remains steadfast. I might be able to do without God, but I cannot do without what God does. God then emerges not as an object of belief, but an abstraction that illuminates a structural necessity, a mythical hallucination at the limit of knowing. What is God if not the fantastical residue of the omnipotent parents in early infancy? And if every attempt to reinstate this omnipotent caretaker is destined for failure, can one still surrender not to God, but to the imminent necessity of surrender itself? Even when declared dead, God remains performatively operative. Her messengers are working tirelessly. The shaman, the psychoanalyst, the teacher, the politician, the doctor, the scientist, authority figures who are presumed to know more than others, who can tell others what to do or at least where to look. It is almost irrelevant whether or not they actually possess the knowledge. Their proximity to godlike omnipotence does not come from who they are, but from what is projected onto them. They are made into vessels. Vesseling speaks to a paradoxical practice of stepping into an eroticized structure of power over others, while simultaneously renouncing that authority. To be looked at as the one who knows the unknowable is to be endowed with the impossible desire of others, their need for orientation, their demand for meaning. Vesseling entails the frustration of that desire, to receive without being pulled in, to redirect attention away from oneself and toward the need of others. Without that frustration, the vessel collapses into a kind of delusion, becomes ensnared in the fascistic fantasy of one's own omnipotence. No longer a vessel, but God himself. The ambivalent practice of vesseling is clearly articulated in Psychoanalysis, The Impossible Profession, Janet Malcolm's detailed ethnography of analytic practices in 1970s New York City. In a passage describing the analyst's relation to the patient, a psychoanalyst appearing under the pseudonym Aaron Green reflects on this inversion of power. In the popular imagination, the analyst is an authoritarian, dominating figure who has rigid control over a malleable, vulnerable patient. What my first case forcibly impressed upon me is that the reverse is true. It is the patient who controls what is happening, and the analyst who is a puny, weak figure. Patients go where the hell they please. All the analyst can do is say, if you deign to listen to me for a moment, if you could divert your attention to this particular place instead of that one, you may see that, etc., etc. That's all that he can do. In this sense, psychoanalysis offers a kind of blueprint for vesseling, one that is not confined to the clinical space. It stages a process in which the structure of dictatorship must be assumed in order to be continually relinquished. I'm reminded of something that my shaman Korean Mudang Jen Kim says, she warns me that I might need to get initiated as a shaman myself. It is a warning because initiation is a serious matter. After getting initiated, your life no longer belongs to you, but to the gods and deities that you serve. I used to be quite afraid of this prospect, but now I understand that this submission to God shouldn't be taken so literally, but more as a safeguard, a boundary that prevents a shaman from becoming intoxicated by power, from mistaking themselves for the source of what passes through them, from collapsing into the delusion of being God. It is of utmost importance to accept that your life is never yours. What is the autonomous I, if not another godlike hallucination, who, like the analytic patient, thinks they can go where the hell they please? As an artist and teacher, I'm tempted by this narcissistic hallucination every day. Okay, some of my students are here, but young, vulnerable students. Young, vulnerable students worship the image of me. They throw their bodies at any task that I offer. Not unlike how soldiers follow the directives of their general. The audience places me on a pedestal with their projected fanfare, and meaning begins to accumulate around my work in ways that I cannot control. It makes sense to me why artists often become more famous after they are dead. What is a better vessel than a corpse? A perfect receptacle, a pure projection surface of immortality, an image that cannot refuse what is made of it. Similar then, what is a better dictator than a dead dictator? God have mercy on us all. Thank you.
I hope somebody faints tonight. You like that? Thank you. Okay. I mean it. I don't say things I don't mean. Okay. First, let us be taken to extremes. The head spins, and then you're overcome with a slight vertigo. You underestimate it, you think you're going to make it, but it comes over you too quickly, and soon you're in its grip, and suddenly, sharply, overcoming your will, or perhaps obeying it. Your muscles slacken, and you become silk. You billow to the floor, hitting the ground that for a moment ago disappeared beneath you, but has now received your fall, not that you'll remember that later. A voyage is underway, but you won't be there for it. You'll disappear into a void, a hole in time, a hole from which you will eventually re-emerge. Fainting is an intimate experience. It's intimate to faint in front of strangers. It's intimate to lose control of yourself so lusciously in front of another. And it's intimate to be present for somebody else's fainting, to be watching their body fall while their consciousness dissolves. It is intimate to know that you're present for something they are absent from, and the memory of which they will never fully recoup, but you will have it. Fainting institutes an absence that will stay with you as a presence, an edge beyond which you can't reach. You will eventually come back, you will return and start over. Who will plug up the holes that are left behind? Psychoanalysis is happy to oblige. For the psychoanalyst Bukowski, your faint was about protecting you against your unmitigated aggression. For the psychoanalyst Bird, fainting was your psyche's mechanism to prevent you from acting out on something you shouldn't have. For Bloch, a woman's fainting is best seen as a temper tantrum. Produced, for example, as Ernest Jones said, and this is actually a quote, when her husband refuses to buy her a hat. This is actually a quote. For Freud, who was himself famously a fainter, fainting is a clinical scenario allotted to women. It is the hysteric, always a woman, who spreads out like a flower to faint in a stylized way before others who will hurry towards her unresisting body, slapping her gently, calling her with concern, taking out the fainting salts until she comes to, and then the world can forget about her again, not thinking to ask her where from she has returned. Follow the path of the unconscious, analyze dreams, slips, parapraxis, and the transference, and you're promised to come into a clearing. Most everything can be illuminated, made explicable, why you fainted, what it meant, what the function of your fainting amounts to, and now you know. Know thyself, a la Socrates, one of the Greeks credited with the founding of philosophy, Western that is, always Western philosophy, and hence of civilization, Western that is, always Western civilization. From within this dizzyingly claustrophobic promise, and I do think that the promise to understand oneself or to explain somebody to themselves is an incredibly claustrophobic, if not totalizing promise. From within this totalizing promise, how do we insist, as Glissant insists we do, to the right to opacity? How do we resist the totalitarian regime of meaning-making that psychoanalysis, especially the radical chic psychoanalysis that is having its heyday right now? And radical chic is a term that I borrow from my colleague and dear friend Lara Shiha. The totalitarian logics of meaning that psychoanalysis wants to drag us into, promising transparency and the clarity of self-understanding. But resist we must, I would argue, because make no mistake, at the end of that psychoanalytic rainbow is the pot of gold of that Western subjectivity so prizes, the autonomous subject whose personal and social coordinates can be accurately plotted, over determinism, anyone? And whose gaps and voids in memory and otherwise can be fully filled in. This is one of the reasons that I fell so hard for Laplanche, and I only realized today as I was listening to Eng that kind of like the falling for is also a fainting for. So now I'm going to be saying that I fainted for Laplanche. The psychoanalyst that I think is most committed to the ethics of opacity, most resistant to the demand for transparency that psychoanalysis evangelizes, even if it argues to do the opposite. For Glissant, opacity is that which cannot be reduced to the terms by which Western thought demands transparency. For Laplanche, it has to do with an otherness in ourselves, which is actually never quite ours. It arises through the intervention of the other, which is sexual through and through. For him, the point of psychoanalysis is not to bring things to light. It is to put in motion processes by which the subject may come undone. to invite, as he puts it, the death drive into the consulting room. And this, indeed, is a very different kind of psychoanalysis. It feels different when you're in it, and it feels different when you are treating somebody in a way that you can get lost in something as opposed to being in possession of something. This, however, is not your usual death drive. In other words, Laplanche is not wanting analysts to invite destructiveness or hatred into the consulting room, or maybe he does. What he teaches us is how the work proceeds not on the principle of feel-good regulation, but also and especially when the demonic forces of the drive, the libidinality but also unbinding, can come into the room. And it is this psychoanalysis, it is this that is the domain of the enigmatic that I'm interested in, where not the healing of wounds or the filling in of memory gaps is what we're after, but the vista of experience, of the uncanny, and of psychic transformation. And that is something that a lot of psychoanalysts turn away from. Both the field turns away from it, and we see this very intensely in the last few years in the psychoanalytic ecosystem that would much rather preserve the peace and not invite in the death drive, which is what would have to be done in order to talk about Palestine and in order to talk about the genocide in Iran and Lebanon, to talk about what's happening in the world without trying to tame it. To talk about Israel, to talk about apartheid, all of these require the engagement of the death drive. They're not things that can be understood, and this is kind of like the appropriative controlling mechanism that I'm speaking against when I'm speaking about like this emphasis to over-understanding everything. We love, in psychoanalysis, the death drive that explains to you what destructiveness is. We love to talk about how war crimes, well, but if you're educated enough, you know that's how war works. So it has kind of like a really pacifying effect. That's not the death drive that we need. And this also happens in the clinic when the priority right now is in patients, especially feeling emotionally well-regulated, even amidst fascism, the invasion in Lebanon, the ongoing genocide, with what's happening with trans people and the target they have on their backs. Psychoanalysis would much rather keep things as stable as possible. And you see that kind of like that already I'm speaking from a place that has both connections, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation with you, and both connections and also both anxieties and disappointments with the field. Some of you may know that a few years ago I became obsessed, as if a force had taken hold of me, a strange appetite that I could not really understand, with Jeremy O'Harris's Slave Play. I wrote about slave play, trying to cope with the strain, including the strain of excitement that this theatrical piece roused in me. I was preoccupied then with the fact that in most performances, theater goers would walk out. They would leave the theater. Oftentimes, they would get up and leave in a very kind of like loud way. They would gather their things slowly in a very passive-aggressive way, like in a very performed way. Upset by the play's propositions regarding racialization and the erotics of trauma. I'm currently working intensely on another piece of performance theater, of performance art. I mean, it's talked about as theater, but I see it more as performance. At this moment, The Bride and the Goodnight Cinderella by the Brazilian artist Carolina Bianchi. In this performance, too, people walk out, but this time, audience members also faint. Initially, and now in retrospect, I think naively, I thought of that fainting in a pretty simplistic way, as if the ego were pulling the plug in an effort to protect itself from being overwhelmed by the encounter with something frightful, in this case, sexual violence, bodily intrusion, memories that affect us but which we cannot retrieve. But with time and with repetition, as I watched the performance more times, and as I saw more people faint, and eventually when the piece came to New York, and when people I knew personally started to faint, that interpretation started feeling quite stale. Fainting began to feel more alive to me, more part of what was happening in the communal space of the theater, less the property of any one individual subject. Chillingly, as I learned recently, people tend to faint at precisely the same two moments in this performance as others have in other performances that they have not spoken to. It turns out that people who faint in that this is not unique to the bride, that people who faint in performances tend to faint around the same moments of the performance. So I have now become entranced with fainting. What if fainting, I began to wonder, is not about the ego defensively shutting down the system? What if fainting is a way by which the engagement with the work, with the artistic work, may be proceeding, albeit on a different register? This would make fainting not a distancing from, but a dissolution into and a surrender into the piece. So what if we thought of fainting as one type of experience that one gets to have in the context of a performance? Somebody that I have a lot of respect for and who is studying with me went and saw the performance. And I saw them after the performance, and they were shaking. And they said to me with great urgency, I need to have a panic attack. I really need to have a panic attack. And I've been thinking about that statement so much. Like, of course, I'm sharing this with their permission. I've been thinking about that statement so much and thinking about what a panic attack has to do with fainting and wondering if one may not be the photographic negative of the other. To go further, I should tell you first a few things about the bride. The bride is not only an unusual and highly traumatophilic piece of performance, it engages unconsciousness as its very subject matter. The piece starts with Bianchi announcing that she is not the protagonist of this performance. The protagonist, she tells us enigmatically, is already dead. 20 minutes into a lecture performance on female performance artists like Ana Mendieta and Tania Bruguera, mostly women from the global south who put their body on the line in their work, Bianchi tells us that she too will do the same. Have people seen The Bride by any chance? Some of you? Yeah. Okay. It is such that she shares her history and also her intentions, which is that 10 years ago she was drugged and raped. Since, she says, quote, I cannot remember the rape, I cannot access what happened. And then she begins to mix the date rape drug in her drink. She will soon drink this concoction, she explains to us, and slowly, as the drug starts acting on her, she will fall unconscious. And when she wakes up, she tells us, she will remember nothing of what will have transpired. And it is this lack of memory of her rape that she repeats, not twice behaved behavior, but twice behaved unconsciousness. Her troupe will take over, and as you will later learn, you will spend the remaining 90 minutes of the performance watching her unconscious body being manipulated on stage. Her limp body will be rearranged around the stage by the other artists. It will be put in a trunk of a car. Somebody will masturbate next to it. It will be placed on a mattress and dragged along the stage. And while the care her troupe pays to her is really astonishing, watching her limbs flop as she's being picked up and laid down, her vulnerability unrelentingly on display, is a deeply unsettling experience. And this is why, by the way, I described this piece earlier as traumatophilic. What Bianchi does that is so disturbing is that she actually takes the date rape drug. She actually falls unconscious. She actually does not remember what happened, and she does that again and again and again. She does usually 2 or 3 performances in a sequence. She doesn't do like 2-week runs, but then she has another set of performances and another set of performances. Bianchi, that is not representing something on the stage. She's revivifying her trauma in real time. And in so doing, she raises questions about risk and safety that are deeply unnerving in real time. In fact, so unsettling is this reenactment that audiences are often incredulous. I can't tell you how many times I've sat with people who have said to me, she didn't really take it. I could tell she was moving. It wasn't real. People are not allowing themselves to take in the vulnerability of the body before them. How can somebody who was raped this way do this to herself again on stage in front of all of us, people wonder. And this, of course, is also the type of disbelief that so hauntingly trails the accounts of women and of all femininities who have been sexually assaulted. Towards the end of the play, her troupe positions her toneless body on the hood of a car. They spread her legs, they insert a scope with a camera in her vagina. They live stream the images on the large screen for the audience to see. That's the first moment that people faint. A voiceover asks Bianchi, how far will you go? How will you know when you've gone too far? And then the voiceover announces, somebody faints in the audience. And indeed, like clockwork, this is the other moment where somebody faints in the audience. It's interesting because the first cluster of people who faint have not yet heard the line, right? And when they wrote the piece, they were not necessarily expecting that anybody would be fainting, so they were quite surprised to watch this happen and really astonished that that's what performance can do. What does it mean for an audience member to faint in a performance where the artist's own exposed, traumatized, and unconscious body is being penetrated on a live stream? One possibility is that you faint because you identify in some way with the history of sexual violence that you may also share, or that somebody you love shares, that it becomes too much and that the psychic system is taxed beyond capacity and shuts down. What if, however, viewers who faint are undergoing something else entirely? What if their faint is neither about shutting down nor about empathic identification with the artist? What if they are in some ways joining them? In other words, what if we took fainting as a response to an invitation to enter the horror of violence and femicide with the artist, to join her in her state of immobility and non-memory, to join her from a place of non-being, to join her in her own negation by means of one's own negation. From this perspective, fainting becomes a possibility for a form of collectivization, where the audience member too surrenders to the piece, allowing themselves to be taken over by something. To be able to faint, that is, the viewer would have to allow themselves to become dispossessed of their own subjectivity, to allow themselves to be scooped out of their own form of understanding or relating to the work enough as to become occupied, possessed in a different kind of way. Possessed, if you will, by the forces in Bianchi's traumatophilic performance unleashed in the performance space. To say this differently, if the bride does not represent trauma on the stage for the purpose of, and it doesn't do so for catharsis, like for her to get over something, to work something through, which of course is the predominant psychoanalytic perspective on how you would understand repetition. And indeed, there is a huge car that sits on the stage that has a plate that reads, "Fuck catharsis." A favorite moment for me. Nor is the point to garner a feminist solidarity or name the unending cycles of femicide and sexual assault alone, though that also happens, no. The work summons the erotic and demonic dimensions of trauma. Trauma, writes Freud, makes sexuality active again. This is something that I think we still continue to have a very hard time thinking about. We want our sexuality clear from trauma and kind of like consensual and kind of like packaged in all of the forms that will keep us safe. The work, in other words, when it, kind of like by summoning them, summoning the erotic, the libidinal, and the demonic dimensions of trauma, it summons the way in which one summons forces from the underworld. And indeed, the piece starts with Dante's Inferno. It calls up, that is, and then lets loose in the room the kinds of energetic intensities that Laplanche describes as the sexual death drive, and which we were talking about earlier as being the point of what he thinks should be happening in the consulting room. Forces that are both dysregulating and by virtue of their dysregulation open up the path to transformative possibilities. But of course, that always comes at a cost. How much will you pay for it? And this brings up questions of self-preservation and brings up questions of expenditure that I'm not going to go into right now, but maybe in our conversation later. And in this sense, then, fainting would not be a form of disappearing oneself from the experience, but rather a form of participating with which the audience members might respond to the unleashing of these forces. But I would want to clarify here that when I use the word participation, I'm not doing so in its usual sense, when we refer to a subject, a bound subject who decides to do an activity, participate in something, and then proceeds to do so. To the contrary, I'm speaking about a form of participation that is made possible precisely by one's permeability, by one's porousness, and by one's willingness to surrender one's sense of control over the situation. For example, if you don't find yourself becoming preoccupied with trying to understand the piece of art, trying to wonder if the performer is really unconscious, or upset that she's putting herself at risk, or feeling sorry for her, or reducing the piece to feminist politics. I'm not saying that the piece may not also generate all these kinds of responses, but these are also ways of controlling your relationship with a piece as opposed to giving yourself over to it. To faint in response to the unsettlement in the room, that is, one has to allow oneself to be dispossessed from a self that is accustomed to doing the work of understanding, of judging whether they like or not the art, of trying to analyze its intentions and parse out its politics. From that I'm not saying that we don't also do that. I'm just talking about the experience in the moment. From that perspective, fainting may belong to the class of phenomena that I have elsewhere described as materializing at the border of our consent. The kind of fainting that I'm talking about is not something one decides to engage to. One does not choose to faint. It is one that can take possession of us precisely when we become permeable to the disturbance, when we suffer the experience we are undergoing, not suffering the experience that we imagine the other person is undergoing, as opposed to consuming the art or evaluating the performance. And thus conceived fainting in performance could also be seen as an experience of overwhelm. In my work, I have been pointedly using overwhelm as a noun. This unexpected use is aimed to defamiliarize us from its more common use as a verb and from its adjectival form, as when we describe something as problematically overwhelming. It is otherwise, to say this otherwise, my use of the word overwhelm as a noun is meant to dissolve the links between the world and how we're accustomed to understanding it in a negative way, and to usher in other possibilities for what can happen precisely through the possibility of overwhelm. Overwhelm allows contact with one's own opacity, with the irreducible singularity in all of us. And fainting in this sense might be seen as a response beyond discourse, beyond exegesis and analysis, beyond representation, materializing at the discursive cliff over which ordinary communication, that is communication that is about communicating in the everyday sense of the word, between bound subjects breaks down. Another form of relation becomes possible at this border. This is what the psychoanalyst Dominique Scarfone calls intersubjectality, what Maurice Blanchot called infinite conversation, and what Glissant describes as the poetics of relation. As I already mentioned, the exposure to the sexual death drive does not necessarily mean that somebody will be able to endure it. To follow that alterity in oneself is to follow the exigency of the unconscious. And here, when I'm talking about the alterity in oneself, I'm not talking about like a centered kind of like subjectivity. I'm talking precisely about that which does not belong to us and which is stimulated in this experience or is roused in this encounter with the otherness of the artist's art, the artist's work. To follow that alterity in oneself is to follow the exigency of the unconscious, to not try to slow it down or to try to catch up with it, but to linger in it, to linger in a void that cannot be fully accounted for through memory or the historical event. And I'm thinking here of the many ways in which psychoanalysis also gives us a way of understanding the unconscious as a warehouse of memories that are just what they are, and you recover them accurately or inaccurately, but there's a true thing. Maybe you have access to it, maybe you don't, and that I argue is actually a pretty impoverished way of thinking about the unconscious. I wonder, for example, if this is what makes the difference between those who will leave a performance, refusing to experience the stretch of themselves that the work invites, and those who can endure staying and who may or may not subsequently faint. If it sounds strange to hear me say that to be able to faint takes endurance, I'm working precisely on that edge between dispossession and a certain kind of kind of like sovereignty that is not the sovereignty in the way we usually think about sovereign subject to it. It's more the way in which Bataille talks about sovereignty. So if it sounds strange to hear me say that to be able to feign takes endurance, it is only because we're accustomed to thinking about experience and relation as proceeding from bound intentional subjects, as opposed to arising from within one's dispossession in the contact with the other. It is precisely this form of relation, I would argue, that can make the space of performance so powerfully transformative. More important than the clarity promised by art that teaches us something, or that represents something to us, or presents us back to ourselves, or that offers catharsis, is getting as close as possible to the state of confusion that comes with lingering in the wound of trauma, in the glare of the sexual drive, and to do so in the co-presence with other bodies. This perhaps might be another way to think about a solidarity that works not with identity, but with opacity, rather than with shared goals and understandings. Collecting this experience in a theater, Bianchi writes, quote, can stir some things, because what happens on the stage is real. Kind of like these kind of like summonings and these spirits kind of like are actually very real. In some ways, they're more real than what we usually think of as reality. And I think that that's something that scares us terribly, because it introduces this quality, and kind of like this is also Bataille. Kind of like it's like looking at the sun; you can't stare at it for too long. What if fainting reopens the communion of wounds in the space of the theater? Not just ones with personal wounds, but wounds that live across histories and on different bodies. The question of how to tell stories of violence, sexual violence, the violence of colonization, with what words and with what vocabulary, misses the fact that terror and the body do the work much better. And that they do so through the simultaneous work of other bodies whose solidarities are in tolerating together the wound and the irreparable, about tolerating being overwhelmed together, perhaps even leaning into it without closing the gap of difference between us. Thank you.
And then this idea of like surrendering to surrender and the sharing of wound, like there's just, it feels like there's such an overlap there. So eventually I'm just curious to see like responses to each other's work tonight. But the thing I want to just start off is like more sort of basic thing of like, I was struck that with both of you brought conceptual tools in the field of psychoanalysis to other modes of practice, you know, to thinking about shamanistic ritual, to thinking about performance art. And so I'm curious just to think about sort of what that, sort of the why and the what of that for you. Like, what does it do to, I mean, maybe in both directions. Like, what does it do to psychoanalysis to think about performance art and shamanistic ritual? What does it do to shamanistic ritual and performance art to think psychoanalytically? You know, what does that do, that sort of crossing do as a place to start and to then open just into responses to each other?
That's great.
I can start first, so you can think a little bit. I don't think so willfully in terms of like how I relate to psychoanalysis. Just I've been in treatment for so long, and then it's like this feeling of this process of what it does to me, and like holding on to it to make sense of what I do when I perform, and so it's not like I run to analytic tools to make sense of it. It's just, oh, it's this thing that I commit to like 4 times a week, and then it actually feels quite close to how I go to rituals when I was a child, and trying to like understand that, and then like start poking around at how possession rituals might actually work, and then was like, oh wait, like this is basically psychoanalysis. And so all these concepts comes way after the like affective kind of real-time processing that happens, and I mean, I feel like psychoanalysis probably is the one thing in Western society that gets to me, like in my heart, to ritual, like in a real earnest way, and I feel like without it, I probably would not stay here in some ways. because otherwise I just feel like this society like lacks these practices of surrendering and sacrifice, and then you just keep hallucinating and worship yourself as God, and then the I becomes God. Whereas I feel like when I'm in psychoanalysis, I'm in such awe of my own like out of controlness. Like when the unconscious erupts, it's just like there's nothing but to be humble. And that's something I really carry into my life and my work. Yeah.
The first thing that I said to Ang after the performance was, you're in a good treatment, in the sense that it is rare to hear a description that is so, kind of like, with so much emphasis on kind of like loosening, as opposed, and kind of like things not just opening up, but also coming undone.
Yeah.
Because kind of like there's a lot of anxiety in the field about patients getting disorganized, like patients not being productive. So even though psychoanalysis has all of the tools to do exactly that, it is not always the case. So kind of like it felt very moving to hear kind of like what the field can be like at its best. I think this is what it looks like at its best. But I think, I would say that, for me too, like it comes from affect first, like what touches me. Like, I think with performance theory and I think with kink theory, because these things actually touch me very deeply. And then the tools become useful in order to think. Yeah. But in terms of like the relationship and the directionality, like one of the things that kind of like when I was training and before I was exposed to, when I was training, I was not exposed to trans studies. I was not exposed to queer of color critique. None of that. All of that I had to do separately and on my own. And the way in which psychoanalysis engaged, kind of like what Laplanche calls the extramural dimension, was in a somewhat cannibalizing way, like taking the tools and saying, we have the tools, we will now explain to you how art works. We will show you where the Oedipus complex is in the play, or where it is in the... And, there are... Kind of like this is something that Anne Pellegrini and I write about in Gender Without Identity as well, that psychoanalysis has kind of like, in a way, we use the metaphor of the Minotaur, kind of like sending tributes to be cannibalized so that something can be kept alive, and we are saying that psychoanalysis is the cannibal here. Kind of like just consuming these discourses to produce sometimes just the most liberal and unimaginative. You see like the differences between us, right? Kind of like you have so much hope for it and so much faith. And as a clinician, I do as a clinician, but as somebody who is also socially in the world of psychoanalysis, I feel so kind of like dispirited. And dispirited actually is interesting to think in the context of what you were saying about possession. I feel possessed with my patients, but not often. I feel possessed in a different way, in a bad way with the field. So there's something about the sedimented thinking that I think can be broken up. I think that's for all disciplines, by the way. I think you always need a parallax view.
Well, one more prompt from me, and then I'll open it up. So get it going, take your notes. I'm just curious if there's a phrase or series of phrases from each other's presentations that are staying with you now, and if we could offer them to each other and see what that might elicit.
I wrote down one thing, which is whole.
Whole.
And then I was like, I'm just gonna listen to you. No, I mean, I like your work and like the way you talk about Laplanche, and it's like has been so instrumental to how I was able to make the connection for myself with shamanism, like from the shift of like the individual and the drive of the subject towards this thing that's all about otherness, and this language around mythosymbolic and like puncturing in and this enigmatic residue, like all of it sounds so magical. Like I think by kind of trying to swim my way through this Laplanchian world, and I was like, oh wait, this is like actual magic. Yeah. So and it makes sense that you are now like talking about the demonic force of trauma, which I'm like, yes, like we need to be more in touch with demons and spirits and actually bring them in because they are us.
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying, like, I have this feeling too. I'm actually quite in love with psychoanalysis. Like, I really do think it's I also hate it. But I think these two have to go together. Otherwise, you become somebody's subject. But what you're saying about the magical dimension of it, like, really speaks to me. I really think that everybody should be in psychoanalysis if they can. I really think that it can change your life in a way that, at least from my experience, nothing else has. And it can be really, it can be startling, and it can also be a humongous failure. And kind of like that's a risk. So, some of the things that stood out, I did take some notes because I was so taken by your language also. But, some of the things that stood out, and I really loved also some of the contradictions of how you were playing with things. So how do you know that you will not be led astray, that you will lose yourself to something worthwhile? I was really like, my inclination would be to go to, but it's a risk. You don't know. You have to play the game. You have to throw the dice. But I was still very enchanted by the hope that there would be a way to know that you make. But then it becomes an investment.
It's very expensive.
It is expensive, yeah. So I kind of like, I was thinking a lot about what you said about also expenditure, like how much do you spend yourself down? It's something that I've been thinking about recently, and I'm very interested in.
Yeah, I mean, like, that's also super influenced by Bataille for me, which I'm like, oh, he does a lot of anthropology, and like that's like the principle of shamanistic economies. You just spend. Like, there's no conservation. You just, like, people sell their house to do these rituals, and that's how they work. Like, it's less about the power of the shaman, but it really comes from you and your ability to spend, willingness, not even ability. Yeah.
Well, with that, let's open it up. So, great, we have a question here, and we are mic-less tonight, so we'll repeat things on the mic if we need. But so yeah, let's start here.
One of the things I'm really curious about as a trauma therapist, I'm curious how this fits into your framework, is the subject of epigenetic flashbacks and history and trauma. How our genes can re-express trauma we've been through, especially as two people from cultures that have been victim of attempted annihilation. And I feel like I've experienced 2 episodes of that, which now I'm wondering, like, about possession, about like the unexpressed through these different scenarios you guys have posed. So I wonder if that is something that fits into the psychoanalytic framework. And also I want to compliment, I'm very curious, and now I'm famously antagonistic towards psychoanalysis. So you guys have like marked some magic into it for me, so thank you.
We recruit. If I haven't turned you off already. Do you want to go first, or do you want to? Okay. I think, I mean, there's tons of literature in the psychoanalytic domain on intergenerational transmission of trauma, on kind of like how that lives in the body, how it gets transmitted, and many theories. For me, like, I have a lot of, I think that we need to be careful about how we think about intergenerational transmission, because intergenerational transmission, which is the idea that kind of like the trauma of the generations, of many generations ago, continues to live on later, like the trauma of kind of like enslavement, the trauma of the Holocaust, that we have to be careful to not confuse how trauma gets lived on with how history gets told. Because oftentimes, the sciences, and especially psychoanalysis, has been very guilty of taking the subjective experience of trauma and how that has sedimented on a person, and then treating it as a historical artifact of what actually happened. And bodies and psyches and libidinal expressions can tell us all kinds of things, but they don't give us the truth. They give us always something that is always already compromised. And that doesn't mean that it's not true for the subject, or that it may not have been true familially or culturally. But, for somebody who thinks a lot about Palestine and Zionism, kind of like a lot of the theory about intergenerational transmission has been through the Shoah, and it's rife with Zionism. So you learn the one, you inhale the other. And now psychoanalysis needs to do the work of separating them out. So this is what, in my own thinking, I call traumatophobia, as opposed to traumatophilia, like the idea that kind of like the over-narrativization of trauma, and trauma where we know exactly what it is, what it's like those of us who are trained as trauma therapists are also trained to expect a certain set of things that actually make us sclerotic around it, right? Like, so somebody who's traumatized should think like that, walk like that, do like that, and then we also have a history. We have like a whole system of thinking a person, and that's a huge problem. You can't get lost in that, and I think it's very important for clinicians too to be able to get lost, which we don't get lost in the same way that our patients do, but we too need to be dispossessed in some way. Yeah.
Here.
I'm thinking about fainting and the times that people have fainted in my performances, and I always thought it was about fluids. So often, like, there was a camera in my mouth, I was getting surgery, like the moment that blood, spit, puke, like seeing people fainting with Franco B, with Kira Riley, like something about the vessel breaking and the kind of vulnerability of that. But also the other times I've seen people faint is in church. So like taken over by the spirit of possession. So like how, which is, I also thought it was like incredibly performative, and sometimes I doubt it's real, but it's that kind of doubt is always there in a way. But thinking about the vessel that you mentioned a lot, and this sort of breakage of the vessel as this moment of, I never thought about it as solidarity with the performer, which, so I'm wondering about those things.
Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll offer you a third vignette of fainting where my friend Crystal and I, we did a performance, and then all we did was chanting. And we were doing a repetitive movement, and somebody behind us just fainted. And that was, if anything, was quite close to like this church, or my reference would be like in a temple, like in a shaman's temple, and somebody faints. And I wish, now I look back in that moment, I wish we could just have gone on performing. But people freaked the fuck out. Like, people start calling the 911. They interrupted everything. They turned all the lights on, and so like the whole infrastructure come in to just kind of like
To interrupt it.
Yes, to interrupt and protect and
Yeah.
let's not keep going. And I don't know why.
I think this is really that response is really interesting, because from one perspective, people are concerned, scared, whatever.
Yeah.
I kind of get that. But also, the panic we could also read as the others are also sensing that something larger is at stake.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah.
if indeed there's something about like trying to slow this down.
Yeah.
Kind of like this is kind of like a collective response to something that is felt by everybody but expressed by the fainter, perhaps. But I think that what you're saying is really interesting. First of all, I want to say the person who asked the question is Emilio Rojas, with whom I had an experience in his performance recently where I just want to say this, I felt in my body the partition line in Cyprus in a way that I hadn't before because of your work. And I had never had an experience like that before, so I'm going to be saying it now every time we're in public. Okay, so to your question, I want to, do we have time? Can I share a quick vignette? I was thinking of putting this in my presentation today, but I didn't. I think that you're right, like a lot of the fainting happens around blood. Like there's Ron Athy, there's Sarah Kane, clans, like, Grand Guignol. Like with Grand Guignol, there was like a lot of blood and a lot of experimentation of how to make blood kind of like thick and clot and look realistic. So I hear what you're saying. And I think for sure there's something about the raw exposure of the body and the proximity to death, to one's own mortality, to one's kind of like libidinal connection with our kind of like sheer vulnerability. But I'll tell you a very quick story. Several years ago, my trans friend, a very, very good friend of mine who's trans, called me and said to me, I'm going to go have bottom surgery. She doesn't speak English. Would you come with me? I said, of course. And she and her friend were having her surgeries back to back. And she said to me, I want you to go in and record it. I want to see what happens. So here is the scene of unconsciousness that I will be present for and she won't be. She talked the doctor into letting me into the theater, right, the surgical theater. Her friend goes first, and I've prepared myself to be able to record, and I faint. And I go down to my friend, and I come to, and the doctor's in front of tending to the patient. I'm like, are you okay? So I go down to my friend who has heard about it, and she's kind of mad at me. And she says to me, you're so useless. I sent you in here. For anybody who speaks Greek, she said to me, it's achristi, delos achristi. And I said to her, I'm prepared now. If you get me back in there again for your surgery, I know I can do it. And she talked the doctor again into it. And the doctor, before it started, said to me, you're not going to faint on me again, right? And I said, no, I won't. And I didn't. And she had her surgery, and I recorded it, and she has her photos. And when I think about, and when I saw her again, she lives in Greece. When I saw her again, the first thing she did, she said, come, let me show you what we did. And she wanted to show me her genitals and show me how it's healing from the dilations. And for me, in the moment, it felt like I was failing her. But in retrospect, it felt to me like we went through something together. And it's not the same thing. It's not on the level of identity. It's not on the level of we had the same experience. Not at all. But it is a kind of solidarity that is embodied. And, I'm not saying that I fainted as a gesture. That's the dispossessive. But she and I went through something together, and it's entirely different. Yeah. I think that's the more opaque dimension of. That's a very different kind of solidarity. And I wasn't thinking of it that way until I started thinking about fainting. And I think there's so many other ways that we can think about solidarity that go beyond the very restrictive epistemological ways in which we think about solidarity. So, yeah.
Yeah, we'll come here to Miran, and then to the front row, and then we'll see. That might be maybe one more. We'll see. Yeah. Okay, great.
Okay, I don't know if I'm projecting enough, but thank you so much. I have a question that is not psychoanalytical. It's but you mentioned genocide and you mentioned war, and I was thinking of the repeated exposure to bombs, drones, destruction of permanent destructions of your surroundings, and how that sense of overwhelm. I'm saying this because of Lebanon as well, but that sense of overwhelm doesn't really contribute to the forming of a solidarity of any sorts, but really sort of dehumanizes the subject in a way that's aligned with, the project of the enemy. And so I feel like that debasement is not really serving, but I'm talking in real life, so we're not talking about art. But I was thinking about the connection since you mentioned genocide. So that's one point. But if I have to sort of translate this to a more kind of artistic context, I was thinking about Brecht and how interpolation was meant to sort of appeal to a conscious individuated subject, and it was a sort of call for action, and that fainting could be seen as the opposite of that, right? A sort of total call to sort of inaction, almost as a way of sort of getting rid of any kind of mediation, right? We are in this experience together, we are fainting, responding, etc. And I don't know, and this is a question, if getting rid of mediation is a way to truly sort of address the power structures that enable the kind of traumas that the actors are, experiencing.
I don't even know how to respond to that in a lot of ways. I think it's what is coming up a lot for me is the word is willfulness. There's something so willful about what are you doing with this, about this, and I'm thinking a lot about my body of work around war and how that has been so much around the impossibility of actually make work about it.
To make work about
war, and to like be real present in it, because so much of I mean, I turn to Christina Sharp a lot when talking about war, and her articulation of blackness and anti-blackness as the weather and the totality of it. Like, you can't really talk about genocide, that is like surrounding you, and like try to like make sense of that thing, and like I can't quite ever make sense of my parents' experience, and like the like humidity that like to me like lingers in the air, that like presses into the skin, and like it's not even like the body can sense it. It's just it's completely. And like language breaks down for me in that way, and I go into this sort of state. But that is kind of like a body response to your question, where I feel like there needs to be more reckoning with that failure of what can we do, and I just want more surrender, and just I don't know, it's fucked.
I really appreciate your question. And I think that questions, when you said, well, it's not about art, but it's about reality, I think that reality needs to also be about art, not necessarily in a representational way, and sometimes in a representational way, but in the following sense. I don't think that the fainting is the end of the conversation. Like when I say solidarity, that solidarity begins with the fainting, and kind of like something else hopefully happens after. I have a lot of hope for what art can do in that respect, but because it can get past your defenses. It's not about arguments. Once you have an experience, then you have to tussle with it. Maybe you dismiss it, maybe you do something else. But for me, that's the beginning of something. So it's not the end of it. Like there's a line that Carolina Bianchi has. She says, if you leave the theater, if you don't want to be exposed to this and you leave the theater, you need to know that you left something on the table. Will you or won't you? Like some people will be like, oh my God, that was disgusting. I don't want to have anything to do with it. Let's go have drinks. Those people you may not be able to touch. But to me, like the question of willfulness is actually very connected to surrender. Like I'm writing about sadism right now, and kind of like trying to rethink of sadism from the perspective of an ethical sadism, the kind of sadism that can power resistance, and that can give us tools with which to think resistance. Because understanding genocide, for me, like, psychoanalysis has so many theories about understanding violence and understanding fascism, and like, you know what, like fuck that. I want theories that tell us how to resist. Not theories that tell us how to submit or to understand how we become kind of like accustomed to our circumstance. And for that, I think we need libidinality, and we need the kind of unbinding death drive to be able to have these conversations and tolerate the tensions that need to come up. As for overwhelm, like I think that people who are kind of like colonized people who are in occupation, people who are kind of like being genocided, are overwhelmed in a different way than the one that I'm speaking about. I would like to see people in this country, I would like to see Jewish people who grew up in Zionist home become overwhelmed in a way that generates a crisis and perhaps a transformation. So it's kind of like that's the way that I think about it. That I think that crisis is important. Thank you. Free Palestine.
We're gonna have one more question, and then we'll head into the night. So thank you so much.
Not as in depth as other questions, but like, I'm curious about the idea of nature, especially in like on top of like shamanism. I think has a lot of narrativization around nature, and also does a lot of like physical movements, at least like in East Asia, that I'm familiar with. And there's a lot of like bodily, and also how fainting and death is kind of like the conscious is hitting the wall against the corporeality of the body. So
feel like there's some, I wonder if it's kind of talk about like the relation between like magic, reality, or like nature, body, and then like civilization, science, conscious.
I don't know, girl. I feel very ill-equipped to answer any of these questions. I just think, okay, this crowd of literary, y'all need to think less. I really think, like, you guys are using words to, like do some acrobatics that I'm not following. It's just like, I think we need to, like, get into this, like, actually, like, bodily solidarity. Like, let's communicate, like, for real. Like, let's actually talk. Like, I don't know what is happening.